The bulldozer blade hit my front gate at 6:12 in the morning. Metal screamed against metal, and the sound rolled across my 1,200-acre ranch like a warning siren. 3 HOA trucks were parked on my private road, blocking the only paved access into Willow Creek Estates. Their crews were cutting my chain, pulling my fence posts, and forcing open the access road that I owned from cattle guard to county pavement. Behind them, a line of residents waited in luxury SUVs, engines idling, trapped unless that road stayed open. What they did not understand was simple. I controlled the only gate system, the only maintenance easement, and the only legal road connecting their entire subdivision to the outside world. That was their first mistake. The smell of diesel hung low in the cool Texas air. Dust lifted in thin brown sheets under the bulldozer tracks. A man in a gray suit stepped around the machine with a leather folder pressed against his chest, careful not to get his polished shoes dirty. He looked more annoyed than nervous. That told me plenty. He walked straight up to me and handed over a packet of court papers. The top page was stamped with a temporary access order. Under that was a civil lawsuit filed by Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. They were suing me for interfering with what they called community road rights. I read that phrase twice while the chain still swung from my gatepost. Community road rights. On my land. Behind the lawyer, Victoria Ashcroft stepped out of a pearl white Mercedes SUV. She wore a cream blazer, oversized sunglasses, and the kind of smile people use when they believe the room already belongs to them. Except we were not in a room. We were standing on my ranch, on gravel I paid to maintain, beside a gate my crew installed, on a road that crossed 3 miles of land recorded under my name. She lifted one hand, like she was calming traffic. The bulldozer kept rumbling behind her. "Mr. Walker," she said, smooth as poured honey. "This does not need to be unpleasant. The neighborhood depends on this road." I looked past her at the line of cars stretching toward the subdivision entrance. Brake lights glowed red in the dawn haze. Children stared through back windows. A delivery van sat boxed in near the shoulder. This was bigger than me now. That was exactly how she wanted it to look. I am Ethan Walker. I am 44 years old, a civil engineer, and I spent 20 years designing roads, drainage systems, and access plans across Texas Hill Country. I know the difference between a public road, a private road, and a road people only use because nobody has checked the records in decades. Victoria did not know that yet. Or maybe she knew and thought pressure would work faster than paperwork. Either way, she had brought machines, lawyers, and half her neighborhood onto land she did not own. The sheriff's deputy arrived 10 minutes later. He stepped out slowly, looked at the lawsuit, looked at the gate, then looked at me. I could hear gravel crunch under his boots. His face tightened just enough for me to notice. He was not comfortable. Victoria noticed too. She moved closer and lowered her voice, but not enough. She told him the county had already recognized the road as essential access. She said any delay would create a safety issue. She said the HOA had no choice. That phrase stayed with me. No choice. People say that when they have already chosen too much. I folded the papers and slid them under my arm. The bulldozer idled 5 feet from my broken chain. Its exhaust blew across the fence line in gray pulses. Victoria's smile never moved, but her fingers tightened around her phone. She expected me to yell. She expected me to threaten. She expected a landowner with dirt on his boots to look smaller beside a lawsuit. I did not give her that. I just looked down the road, past the gate, past the waiting cars, toward the bend where my property swallowed the asphalt. Then I saw something nailed to my fence. A fresh HOA sign. White background. Gold lettering. Willow Creek Estates Emergency Access Route. They had not just used my road. They had named it. That was when this stopped being a property dispute. The sign changed everything. The HOA sign stayed on my fence all day. Every time I looked at it, the white paint seemed brighter. The gold lettering caught the afternoon sun like it belonged. There. It did not. The smell of hot asphalt drifted up from the road as vehicles continued passing through my property. Tire noise echoed across the hills. Dust settled on cedar trees that had stood untouched for decades. By sunset, I counted more than 200 cars. That number bothered me. Not because of traffic. Because people were already treating the road like it had always belonged to them. My ranch sat just outside the edge of Willow Creek Estates. 1,200 acres of rolling hills, grazing land, oak groves, and creek crossings stretched in every direction. Most people saw empty land. I saw 20 years of planning finally turned into reality. I bought the property 3 years earlier after selling my share of an infrastructure company. I was not looking for luxury. I wanted space. Quiet mornings. Working fences instead of conference calls. Real problems instead of corporate politics. The ranch gave me that. Most days started before sunrise. Coffee. Boots. A slow drive across the property. The sound of cattle moving through pasture grass. The smell of dew settling over limestone and cedar. That routine mattered to me, which made the constant stream of HOA traffic feel even more invasive. Around 7 that evening, I drove the length of the road. The pavement cut through my land for nearly 3 miles before reaching the county highway. My maintenance crews resurface sections every year. My company installed drainage improvements long before I purchased the ranch. Every culvert, gate sensor, cattle guard, and maintenance marker existed because somebody paid for it. That somebody was not Willow Creek Estates. A pickup truck slowed beside me near mile marker 2. An older rancher named Clay Harmon leaned out the window. He owned neighboring land and had lived in the area longer than anyone I knew. He glanced toward the traffic and shook his head. "That is a lot of confidence for people who do not own the road," he said. Then he drove away. The comment stayed with me. Clay rarely spoke without reason. After dark, I returned to the main gate. Headlights continued moving through the ranch. The new HOA sign reflected every beam. Something else caught my attention. Another sign had appeared near the entrance. This one directed delivery drivers toward Willow Creek Estates. I parked and walked closer. Fresh post holes. Fresh concrete. Fresh installation. Someone had spent money. Real money. That meant planning. That meant commitment. Mini hook. Temporary access disputes do not usually come with permanent signs. The next morning, I visited the small county records office in town. Not because I planned to fight immediately. I wanted to understand how far this had already gone. The building smelled like old paper and floor polish. Ceiling fans turned slowly overhead. A clerk recognized my name before I even reached the counter. That was unexpected. She disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a folder. Her expression looked cautious. "You are not the first person asking about that road this month," she said. That sentence landed harder than the lawsuit. This had started before the bulldozer. Before the gate. Before Victoria showed up with lawyers and contractors. Someone had been laying groundwork. Quietly. Carefully. I carried the folder outside and sat on a shaded bench beneath a live oak tree. Traffic hummed in the distance. The courthouse clock struck 10. I opened the folder and found several recent inquiries connected to road access, emergency services, and subdivision expansion. Most were routine. One was not. A single application referenced future capacity increases for Willow Creek Estates. Future capacity. The proposal called for 180 additional homes. I stared at the number for several seconds. The courthouse air suddenly felt warmer. Outside, traffic rolled past the square while a flag snapped in the Texas wind. 180 homes meant hundreds of additional vehicles. More deliveries. More emergency services. More dependence on a road they were already claiming as their own. That was not a neighborhood issue anymore. That was infrastructure. I took the folder back to my truck and read every page again. Most of the paperwork carried routine language. Capacity projections. Utility estimates. Population growth. Then I noticed a familiar signature. Victoria Ashcroft. Her name appeared on multiple documents connected to the expansion effort. That caught my attention. HOA presidents usually spend their time enforcing community rules and attending meetings. They do not normally appear throughout development planning paperwork. At least not this often. The drive back to the ranch took 20 minutes. The road climbed through rolling hills and limestone ridges. Cedar trees cast long shadows across the pavement. Normally the view relaxed me. Not that day. Every vehicle passing through my gate seemed different now. I was no longer seeing residents. I was seeing future traffic calculations, future construction, future pressure. By the time I reached the entrance, another surprise was waiting. A landscaping crew was planting decorative shrubs beside the new HOA sign. Fresh mulch covered the ground. Irrigation tubing had already been installed. I parked and walked over. The workers were polite. One of them handed me a work order when I asked who hired them. The client listed on the paperwork was Willow Creek Estates Beautification Committee. Beautification Committee. On my property. The confidence behind that decision was almost impressive. Mini hook. Nobody spends money like that unless they believe they are staying. Later that afternoon, I attended a Willow Creek Estates board meeting. Not as a resident, not as a guest. Just as the owner of the road, everyone seemed eager to discuss without me. The meeting took place inside a large clubhouse overlooking an artificial lake. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and expensive air freshener. Framed photographs lined the walls. Everything looked polished, controlled, planned. Victoria stood near the front speaking with several homeowners when I entered. Conversations softened the moment people recognized me. She smiled immediately. Not a surprised smile. An expected one. That bothered me. Victoria approached with perfect composure. Her blazer matched the navy folders stacked on a nearby table. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I was hoping you would attend." That sentence landed harder than she intended. People hope for things they believe they can manage. I took a seat near the back and listened. For almost an hour, discussions focused on community growth, traffic management, future amenities, expansion opportunities. The language sounded harmless. Yet one detail kept repeating. Access. Every plan assumed uninterrupted access through my ranch. Every projection depended on it. Every growth estimate relied on it. Nobody acknowledged that fact directly. They simply treated it as permanent. Then Victoria reached the final agenda item. A large map appeared on a projector screen. Several highlighted sections outlined future development areas. New streets, new lots, new construction phases. The room brightened under the projector glow. Homeowners nodded with excitement. Victoria tapped one section with a laser pointer. The highlighted route feeding the entire expansion passed directly across my road. She never looked at me while explaining it. She did not have to. Everyone in the room already knew exactly where I was sitting. Then she revealed who was funding the project. The name on the funding slide was Ashcroft Development Group. The room stayed quiet for a second. Then conversation started again like nothing unusual had happened. I sat perfectly still. The projector hummed above us. The artificial lake outside reflected the last orange light of the evening. Victoria stood near the screen with complete confidence. Now the pieces were starting to fit together. This was never just an HOA issue. The neighborhood expansion and the HOA leadership were moving in the same direction. That changed everything. Victoria clicked to the next slide. More future lots appeared. More roads. More construction phases. More projected revenue. Homeowners nodded approvingly. Most of them looked excited. I could not blame them. They were being shown new amenities, higher property values, and promises of growth. What they were not being shown was dependence. Every single projection depended on access through my ranch. Without that road, the entire expansion plan became much more complicated. Mini hook. Nobody in the room seemed concerned about that risk. The meeting ended 30 minutes later. Residents gathered in small groups throughout the clubhouse lobby. The smell of coffee mixed with fresh carpet cleaner. I walked toward the exit. Before I reached the door, Victoria intercepted me. She carried herself like someone used to winning disagreements before they started. "You were very quiet tonight," she said. I looked through the glass entrance doors toward the parking lot. Luxury vehicles filled nearly every space. "I was listening," I replied. Her smile widened slightly. "Good. Then you understand why cooperation is important." Cooperation. Another interesting word. It sounded friendly. It felt expensive. We stood there for several seconds. Neither of us moved. Then she leaned slightly closer. "Growth is coming whether you like it or not." There it was. Not a request. Not a negotiation. A declaration. She walked away before I responded. The parking lot lights reflected off her white SUV as she drove out. I watched the taillights disappear around the lake. Something about that conversation stayed with me. The confidence. The timing. The certainty. People usually become cautious when lawsuits begin. Victoria seemed more comfortable than ever. The next morning provided another surprise. I woke before sunrise and drove toward the south section of the ranch. The air smelled of cedar and damp soil after a brief overnight rain. Fog lingered over the low pastures. Everything looked peaceful until I reached mile marker 3. Fresh survey stakes stood beside the road. Bright orange flags fluttered in the breeze. I stopped immediately. My stomach tightened. There had been no survey markers there the previous afternoon. I climbed out and walked closer. The stakes formed a line extending along the road shoulder. Whoever placed them had done so recently. The soil around each marker was still loose. Mini hook. Survey stakes rarely appear without a reason. By mid-morning, I tracked down the survey company listed on one of the markers. The receptionist was polite but careful. She confirmed their crews had been working under contract. She would not say more. That alone said plenty. Someone was spending serious money before the lawsuit had even reached a courtroom. I spent the rest of the day driving the ranch. The further I looked, the more changes I found. Temporary markers, utility paint, small flags hidden near drainage crossings. None of it was random. Someone was preparing for something larger. Around sunset, I stopped at a ridge overlooking the road. Traffic continued flowing toward Willow Creek Estates. The headlights looked like a moving ribbon across the hills. Hundreds of people depended on that route now. Maybe thousands in the future if Victoria got what she wanted. Then Clay asked me to meet him at the county archive building before opening hours. The next morning, a pale orange sunrise spread across the horizon as I drove into town. The smell of wet cedar still lingered in the air from the previous night's rain. My truck tires hummed against the pavement. I kept thinking about his tone on the phone. Clay was not the type to exaggerate. If he sounded concerned, there was a reason. He was already waiting when I arrived. A long cardboard tube rested across the hood of his pickup. He did not waste time with small talk. He pulled out an old survey map and spread it across a folding table inside the archive room. The paper crackled softly. Some sections had yellowed with age. Others showed water stains from decades earlier. The room smelled like dust, old paper, and floor wax. Clay pointed toward a section near the center of the map. "Look at the date," he said. 1971. I leaned closer. The road crossing my ranch appeared clearly. The route was almost identical to today's alignment. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed something missing. The map did not show any permanent access designation connected to the subdivision. That caught my attention immediately. Mini hook. One missing detail can change an entire case. Clay slid another document toward me. Then another. Then a third. The more records we reviewed, the more uncomfortable I became. Every modern assumption about the road seemed to originate from later references rather than original filings. The road existed. The maintenance routes existed. Several utility crossings existed. Yet the foundation everyone appeared to be relying on felt surprisingly thin. By noon, my table was covered with copies. Survey records, archive planning notes, property sketches. Most people would have found the paperwork boring. To me, it looked like a puzzle beginning to reveal its edges. Then something else happened. A county employee recognized the documents we were reviewing. He stopped beside our table and glanced down at the map. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "I have not seen that version in years," he said. Years. Not decades. Years. That distinction mattered. I asked him when he last saw it. He hesitated. Then he mentioned a planning review meeting that took place roughly 18 months earlier. My attention sharpened immediately. 18 months lined up almost perfectly with the first signs of Willow Creek's expansion efforts. Coincidence felt less likely with every passing hour. The employee could not stay long, but before leaving he offered one useful piece of information. Several infrastructure reviews had been conducted during that period. Access corridors were discussed repeatedly. Some proposals moved forward. Others did not. That was all he would say. Even so, it was enough to keep me thinking during the drive home. The afternoon sun baked the hills. Heat shimmered above the pavement. Traffic continued moving through my ranch exactly as before. The HOA sign still stood beside the gate. Delivery trucks rolled past. Landscaping crews watered freshly planted shrubs. Every visible sign pointed toward permanence. Yet the paperwork was beginning to tell a different story. Around sunset, I stopped beside one of the new survey stakes that had appeared days earlier. The orange ribbon fluttered lightly in the wind. Nearby, a small marker carried a project reference number. I photographed it and sent the image to a surveyor I knew from my engineering days. I expected a response sometime next week. Instead, my phone rang less than an hour later. His voice sounded puzzled. "Ethan, where did you find that marker?" I looked back toward the road. Headlights glowed in the distance. "On my ranch," I answered. Silence filled the line for a moment. Then he said something that made me sit upright in my truck. "That project number is not assigned to a road improvement." My grip tightened on the steering wheel. The surveyor on the phone sounded genuinely confused. That got my attention more than any lawsuit. Confused experts are often more valuable than confident ones. The evening wind pushed across the hills outside my truck. The orange survey ribbon fluttered against the fading sky. "If it is not a road project, what is it?" I asked. Papers rustled on his end of the line. Then he cleared his throat. The reference number appears connected to a future subdivision phase. I looked back toward the road. Headlights flowed through my property in a steady line. The answer did not make me feel better. It made everything worse. A subdivision phase meant those markers were not documenting existing access. They were preparing for expansion. The surveyor continued speaking. You should probably find out who authorized the field work. Probably. That was the understatement of the month. After the call ended, I remained parked beside the stake for several minutes. Crickets chirped in the grass. The smell of warm cedar drifted through the open truck window. Across the valley, the lights of Willow Creek Estates glowed against the darkness. The neighborhood looked peaceful from a distance. Families eating dinner. Children finishing homework. Porch lights switching on. Most residents probably had no idea what was unfolding behind the scenes. Minnie Hook. The people causing the problem were not acting like they expected resistance. The next morning, I started making calls. By noon, I had assembled enough information to see the outline of a much larger plan. Several consulting firms had recently been hired. Traffic studies had been commissioned. Utility capacity estimates were underway. Drainage evaluations had been requested. Each individual project looked harmless. Together, they painted a different picture. Growth was not being discussed. Growth was already being prepared. Around 2 in the afternoon, a courier arrived at my ranch house. He carried another packet from the HOA attorneys. The envelope smelled faintly of printer toner and fresh paper. Inside was a notice related to the pending access dispute. Most of the language was predictable. Then I reached the final page. A timeline estimate projected resolution within months. Not years. Months. That detail bothered me. Large property disputes rarely move that quickly unless someone expects a straightforward outcome. Victoria seemed remarkably certain of success. That certainty kept showing up everywhere. Later that week, the first court hearing arrived. The courthouse was packed. The hallway echoed with conversations and footsteps. The smell of coffee drifted from a vending area near the entrance. Victor. The name on the document was Harold Mercer. I read it twice while standing beside the courthouse steps. Cars moved through downtown traffic behind me. A distant train horn echoed across town. The paper felt fragile in my hands. The date printed at the top was more than 30 years old. Harold Mercer. The name meant nothing to me at first. That changed by the end of the week. Clay and I spent the next several days digging through county archives. The old records room became familiar territory. Dust floated through narrow beams of light. Ceiling fans turned slowly overhead. Every drawer seemed to hold another piece of a puzzle nobody had bothered to solve. Minnie Hook. The deeper we looked, the stranger the timeline became. Harold Mercer was not a developer. He was not an HOA official. He was a ranch owner. Decades ago, he controlled thousands of acres in the same region. More importantly, several historical planning references connected his land directly to the corridor where my road now existed. That alone was interesting. What came next was far more important. One faded planning memo referenced a temporary accommodation agreement. Temporary. The word practically jumped off the page. I leaned back in my chair and stared at it for several seconds. Temporary agreements are not permanent rights. Any engineer, surveyor, or land planner understands that distinction immediately. Yet every modern discussion surrounding Willow Creek Estates treated the road as if permanent access had always existed. The timeline no longer matched the assumptions. Around noon, I stepped outside the archive building for fresh air. The smell of hot pavement filled the parking lot. My phone buzzed before I reached my truck. It was the surveyor I had spoken with earlier. He sounded more interested than before. I found additional references tied to that project number, he said. I listened carefully. Several historical documents pointed toward corridor evaluations, but none appeared to establish long-term ownership or guaranteed access. Nothing definitive, nothing conclusive. Yet the pattern remained consistent. Pieces existed. The final connection did not. That mattered. The next week brought another development. Construction activity around Willow Creek increased noticeably. Delivery trucks arrived daily. New utility markings appeared. Temporary fencing showed up near future expansion areas. Every sign suggested momentum. Victoria was acting like the outcome had already been decided. During one drive through town, I passed a real estate office displaying promotional materials for future phases of the neighborhood. Artist renderings covered the front windows. More homes, more amenities, more growth. The road crossing my ranch appeared prominently on one display map. I stopped walking and stared at it. They were marketing expansion using infrastructure still under active legal dispute. That level of confidence rarely comes from hope alone. Mini hook. Someone believed the paperwork already favored them. Later that afternoon, I met with a property attorney recommended by a former business colleague. His office overlooked the courthouse square. The scent of coffee drifted through the conference room as we spread documents across a large table. He reviewed maps, survey records, historical references, archive copies. Occasionally, he circled a section with a pen. Most of the meeting remained quiet. Finally, he removed his glasses and tapped one document. "You have an inconsistency," he said. My attention sharpened immediately. A good inconsistency or a bad one? I asked. He smiled slightly. That depends on what caused it. Then he pointed toward two records separated by nearly 3 decades. Both referenced the same corridor. Both referenced access. Yet they described the arrangement differently. Not dramatically, just enough to matter. My pulse slowed again. I had seen similar problems during infrastructure disputes earlier in my career. Small discrepancies often reveal larger mistakes hidden underneath. The attorney recommended obtaining original source records rather than relying on later summaries. That advice seemed simple. It turned out to be critical. 2 days later, a county archivist called me directly. Her voice sounded unusually excited. She said they had located a storage box recently transferred from an off-site facility. Several older files matched the corridor references we were researching. Then she mentioned one specific item. An original survey attachment from 1971. I grabbed my keys before she finished the sentence. Something important was waiting in that box. I reached the archive building 20 minutes after the call. The afternoon heat shimmered above the parking lot. My boots echoed across the tile floor as I headed toward the records department. The archivist was already waiting beside a cart loaded with dusty storage boxes. A faint smell of cardboard and old paper filled the room. She pointed toward one container near the bottom. "That is the one," she said. I thanked her and carefully lifted the lid. Dust floated through a beam of sunlight from a nearby window. Inside sat dozens of folders secured with aging rubber bands. Most carried handwritten labels. Some were barely readable. I started sorting through them one at a time. Survey attachments, corridor reviews, planning sketches, utility references. The process was slow. Then I found the survey attachment. My pulse immediately picked up. The paper was folded several times and felt surprisingly fragile. I carried it to a large table and carefully spread it open. The original survey covered a broad section of land that included property now occupied by Willow Creek Estates. Fine pencil markings crossed the map. Notes filled the margins. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. Then I noticed a box section near the lower corner. A notation referenced temporary access accommodations associated with future land transfers. Temporary. There was that word again. Mini hook. The same word kept appearing in records decades apart. I spent the next hour comparing the survey attachment with modern maps. Certain features lined up perfectly. Others did not. One corridor reference looked especially important. The route eventually became the road crossing my ranch. Yet the language surrounding it was noticeably different from what appeared in later summaries. The distinction was subtle. Most people would never notice it. Engineers notice details for a living. That detail bothered me enough to make copies immediately. As I left the archive building, my phone buzzed. It was my attorney. We met later that evening at his office overlooking the courthouse square. The smell of fresh coffee filled the conference room. Ceiling lights reflected off stacks of documents covering the table. I handed him the survey attachment and waited while he read. Several minutes passed without a word. Then he sat back and tapped the page with one finger. "This changes the conversation," he said. Those 4 words were the most encouraging thing I had heard in weeks. He explained that original source material often carries more weight than later interpretations, especially when inconsistencies begin appearing across multiple generations of records. We reviewed every page together. The more we compared, the more questions emerged. Why did later summaries describe the corridor differently? Why did planning references become increasingly confident over time? Why did everyone behave as if permanent access had always existed? Nobody had answers yet. But for the first time, we had something stronger than suspicion. We had a pattern. The next few days moved quickly. My legal team requested additional records. Clay continued reviewing historical property files. The surveyor examined technical references connected to the corridor. Every new discovery seemed to reinforce the same theme. Assumptions had gradually replaced documentation. Then another piece arrived. A retired county engineer named Robert Hayes contacted me after hearing about the dispute. We met at a diner just outside town. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee drifted through the room. Robert carried a worn leather folder filled with notes from projects he worked on decades earlier. Most of the material was routine. One page was not. He pointed toward a handwritten comment attached to an infrastructure review. The note referenced concerns about relying on future access assumptions rather than recorded rights. My attention locked onto the sentence immediately. Robert shrugged. People worried about it back then. That comment stayed with me all afternoon. Someone had seen the problem years earlier. Someone had documented it. Yet somehow the concern disappeared while the assumptions survived. That felt important. Very important. Late that evening, I drove the length of the road again. Headlights moved steadily through the darkness. The HOA sign still stood near the entrance. Traffic flowed exactly as Victoria expected. Yet something had changed. For the first time since the lawsuit began, I could see cracks forming beneath the surface. Small cracks. Technical cracks. Legal cracks. The kind most people overlook until the structure above them starts shifting. Then my attorney called with news from the latest records request. A document had finally been located. And it was not a copy. The original document arrived 3 days later. My attorney called just after sunrise. The smell of coffee filled my kitchen as I stood looking out across the pasture behind the ranch house. Cattle moved slowly through the morning fog. Everything felt calm. Then his voice changed the entire day. "You need to see this in person," he said. An hour later, I was sitting across from him in the conference room. The document rested inside a protective sleeve at the center of the table. No photocopy. No scanned image. The original record. The paper showed its age immediately. Slight discoloration along the edges. Faded typewriter text. Handwritten annotations in blue ink. The room remained quiet while I read. Halfway down the second page, I stopped. Then I read the section again. The language was remarkably clear. The corridor crossing the property had been discussed during a land planning review decades earlier. Temporary accommodation. Limited purpose. Subject to future owner approval. I looked up slowly. My attorney did not say a word. He simply nodded. Mini hook. The sentence we needed had been sitting in storage for decades. We spent the next several hours verifying everything. Dates. Signatures. Reference numbers. Archive chains. Nothing looked out of place. If anything, the record appeared stronger than expected. That afternoon, Clay joined us. So did Robert Hayes, the retired county engineer. Documents covered nearly every inch of the conference table. The smell of paper and fresh coffee mixed together while sunlight drifted through the blinds. Nobody rushed. That was important. Good evidence rewards patience. By evening, a clearer picture had emerged. Somewhere over the years, temporary access assumptions had gradually evolved into accepted facts. Then accepted facts became planning references. Then planning references became expectations. Eventually, nobody questioned them. Nobody except the people now sitting around that table. The next week brought another surprise. Robert located an old colleague who had participated in infrastructure reviews years earlier. His memory remained sharp. We met at a small diner outside town. Ceiling fans spun overhead. Forks clinked against plates. The smell of bacon drifted through the room. He listened carefully while we explained the situation. Then he laughed softly. Not because the case was funny. Because he recognized the corridor immediately. That issue never fully went away, he said. My attention locked onto him. He explained that concerns had surfaced repeatedly during planning discussions. Access assumptions. Future ownership questions. Incomplete documentation. The concerns were raised. Then postponed. Raised again. Then postponed again. Growth moved faster than clarification. That pattern sounded familiar. Mini hook. Problems ignored long enough often become someone else's emergency. Back at the ranch, I began organizing everything into a timeline. Survey attachments. Planning memos. Corridor reviews. Temporary accommodation references. Every document found its place. The process reminded me of engineering failures I had investigated earlier in my career. Rarely does one major mistake cause a collapse. Usually dozens of smaller. Assumptions stack on top of each other until nobody remembers where the first one began. One evening, while reviewing records, I noticed another interesting detail. Several modern planning documents referenced previous reviews without attaching supporting source material. They cited conclusions, not foundations. That distinction mattered. Very few people ever check footnotes once enough time passed. The missing document number dominated the next several days. Every conversation seemed to circle back to it. Every stack of records on my conference table pointed toward the same question. The reference existed. The supporting document did not. That was a problem for someone. We just did not know who yet. The smell of fresh coffee filled my workshop as I converted one wall into a timeline. Maps, survey attachments, planning memos, and archive records stretched across nearly 20 feet of space. Colored notes connected dates and decisions. Strings linked references that appeared decades apart. The setup looked excessive. Then again, so did a subdivision trying to build its future on a road it did not own. Mini hook. Sometimes the missing piece tells you more than the pieces you already have. My attorney filed a formal request seeking clarification on the document reference. The response arrived faster than expected. That alone caught my attention. Most paperwork moves slowly. This did not. The explanation claimed the citation represented a historical planning source incorporated into later reviews. Technically possible, yet something about the wording felt careful. Too careful. It answered the question without actually producing the record. That distinction mattered. Meanwhile, Victoria continued behaving as though victory remained inevitable. Another community meeting was held at the Willow Creek Clubhouse. Homeowners filled the room. Expansion plans dominated the discussion once again. New amenities, new construction phases, new property value projections. Applause followed several presentations. Then Victoria stepped forward and assured residents that infrastructure concerns were being handled appropriately. I noticed she never mentioned the active lawsuit. She never mentioned the road directly. Yet every map displayed behind her depended on it. Confidence is powerful. Confidence backed by assumptions is something else entirely. After the meeting, several residents approached me in the parking lot. Most were polite. A few seemed concerned. One older couple admitted they had purchased property partly because future expansion plans appeared so promising. Another homeowner asked whether the road dispute would delay development. Their questions revealed something important. Many residents genuinely believed everything had already been settled. They were trusting information presented to them. The same information we were now questioning. The following week brought another breakthrough. Robert Hayes called early one morning. The sound of wind pushed through his phone line. He rarely called without reason. "I found someone you need to meet," he said. 2 days later, we sat across from a retired planning consultant named Margaret Collins. She had participated in regional reviews years before retiring. The meeting took place in a quiet library conference room. The air smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. Margaret studied several documents before speaking. Her memory remained remarkably sharp. She recognized corridor references immediately. She recognized Harold Mercer. She even recognized portions of the planning language we had been examining. Then she pointed toward one reference and frowned. That reaction got my attention. "What is it?" I asked. Margaret adjusted her glasses and looked closer. "This summary appears familiar," she said. "But I do not remember it looking exactly like this." Silence settled across the table. Mini hook. Small differences become very important when millions of dollars depend on them. Margaret could not provide definitive answers. She retired years earlier. Records changed hands many times afterward. Yet she confirmed something useful. Historical planning reviews often contained assumptions intended only for preliminary discussions. Those assumptions sometimes appeared in later summaries without the original context attached. The statement aligned perfectly with what we had been seeing. Assumptions becoming expectations. Expectations becoming accepted facts. That evening, I drove through the ranch just before sunset. Golden lights stretched across the hills. The smell of dry grass filled the air. Traffic continued moving through the road. Families returned home from work. Delivery trucks completed their routes. Everything looked normal. Yet beneath that normal appearance, the foundation supporting the entire expansion plan was becoming increasingly unstable. Back at the workshop, my attorney arrived carrying a thick folder. He dropped it onto the table beside the timeline wall. The impact echoed through the room. We reviewed the contents together. Most pages were routine disclosures. Then we found something new. A development consultant's report discussing future growth scenarios. Near the end of the report sat a sentence highlighted by one of the reviewers. The note referenced uncertainty regarding long-term corridor rights. I read the sentence twice, then 3 times. Someone inside the planning process had already identified the risk. The next name attached to that review changed everything. The name attached to the review was Victoria Ashcroft. I stared at the page for several seconds. The workshop felt unusually quiet. Outside, evening wind moved through the cedar trees. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted in through the open garage door. My attorney leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Neither of us needed to say much. The significance was obvious. Months before the lawsuit. Months before the emergency access claims. Months before the bulldozer arrived at my gate. Victoria had already been connected to a report identifying uncertainty surrounding long-term corridor rights. She knew the risk existed. That changed everything. Minnie Hook. The question was no longer whether concerns had been raised. The question was who ignored them. Over the next 2 weeks, preparation became our full-time job. My timeline wall expanded until it covered nearly the entire workshop. Survey maps sat beside planning reviews. Archive records connected to development reports. Historical references linked directly to modern expansion proposals. Every piece had a place. Every date mattered. The smell of coffee became permanent. So did the stacks of binders covering every flat surface. Clay visited almost daily. Robert reviewed technical details. My attorney coordinated disclosures and filings. The deeper we organized the evidence, the stronger the pattern became. Temporary accommodations had gradually transformed into assumed rights. Assumed rights became planning foundations. Planning foundations became expansion strategies. Somewhere in that progression, documentation stopped supporting the conclusions. Yet the conclusions continued anyway. The final hearing approached quickly. Traffic through my ranch remained constant. Utility markings continued appearing near future development zones. Promotional materials still advertised expansion opportunities. Publicly, nothing had changed. Privately, everything had changed. The week before the hearing, Victoria held another community meeting. Several homeowners later shared recordings with my attorney. I listened carefully. Her presentation focused on growth, stability, and future opportunities. Yet one detail stood out immediately. She described access concerns as fully resolved. Fully resolved. That phrase echoed through my head for hours afterward. Because by that point, even her own planning records showed otherwise. Minnie Hook. Confidence sounds different when documents disagree. Hearing day arrived under a gray Texas sky. Low clouds hung over the courthouse square. The air smelled faintly of rain. Reporters from 2 local newspapers waited near the entrance. Homeowners filled the hallways. Developers. Consultants, attorneys, surveyors. The case had grown far beyond a simple property dispute. Everyone seemed to understand that. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt focused rather than dramatic. Papers shuffled. Chairs moved softly across the floor. The judge reviewed preliminary matters before testimony began. Victoria sat several rows away beside her legal team. She appeared composed, professional, confident. The same confidence I had seen from the beginning. The first several hours moved steadily. Technical records, planning timelines, survey, references, historical documentation. Witnesses explained processes and procedures. Nothing happened quickly. Important cases rarely do. Then Robert Hayes testified. The retired engineer spoke calmly. Clearly, decades of experience showed in every answer. He explained corridor planning assumptions, infrastructure reviews, historical concerns. Several exhibits were introduced. The courtroom remained quiet. Even small details suddenly seemed important. Later, my attorney introduced the original 1971 survey attachment. The same document pulled from storage after decades of sitting untouched. I watched as copies moved through the courtroom. Pages turned. Notes were compared. Several people leaned closer. Then came the original record discussing temporary accommodation language. The room seemed smaller somehow. Focused. Compressed. My attorney walked the timeline carefully. No exaggeration. No emotion. Just dates and documents. One fact after another. Then he displayed the development report identifying uncertainty regarding long-term corridor rights. Finally, he revealed the review notation connected to Victoria. Silence followed. not dramatic silence. The kind people create when they are processing information. The judge spent several minutes reviewing the exhibits personally. Nobody spoke. Outside, rain tapped softly against courthouse windows. Inside, years of assumptions sat beside decades of records. For the first time since this began, Victoria looked away from the table in front of her. The hearing ended late that afternoon. No ruling was issued immediately. That was expected. Everyone slowly gathered documents and prepared to leave. Then the judge made one final request before adjournment. He wanted clarification regarding a specific planning reference that nobody had anticipated. The courtroom remained quiet after the judge's request. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Attorneys exchanged brief glances. Pages turned. Pens moved across legal pads. Nobody seemed prepared for the question he had asked. That alone caught my attention. Throughout the case, most arguments followed predictable paths. Access, planning, development, ownership. This was different. The judge wanted clarification regarding the exact planning reference tied to the missing document number. The same reference that had caused weeks of questions. The same reference that seemed to exist everywhere except where it should have existed. My attorney requested additional time to provide supporting material. The judge agreed. Another hearing date was scheduled. Then everyone slowly filtered out of the courtroom. The smell of rain followed us into the hallway. Reporters gathered near the entrance. Homeowners clustered in small groups. Conversations stayed low. Serious. Thoughtful. Nobody looked particularly confident anymore. The assumptions supporting the expansion project no longer seemed automatic. That shift was impossible to miss. Mini hook. Sometimes uncertainty arrives long before a final decision. Over the next 10 days, our team worked harder than at any point during the case. My workshop became command central again. Survey maps covered one wall. Timelines stretched across another. Coffee cups multiplied faster than paperwork. Every document received another review. Every date received another verification. Clay continued digging through archives. Robert examined technical records. My attorney focused on planning references connected to the missing citation. The process felt exhausting. It also felt necessary. Then the breakthrough arrived. It came from a records clerk nobody had spoken to before. A retired employee who spent years maintaining historical planning files contacted the county after hearing about the dispute. He remembered something unusual about document numbering practices used decades earlier. That memory turned out to be incredibly valuable. We met inside a small records storage facility on the edge of town. The building smelled like cardboard, dust, and aging paper. Metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. The retired clerk walked us through historical filing procedures used during the period in question. Then he pointed out something nobody had previously noticed. The document number referenced throughout modern planning materials did not match the numbering format used during the year it supposedly originated. My attorney immediately leaned forward. So did I? The implication was significant. If the numbering format was inconsistent, then the reference itself deserved much closer examination. Several days later, county staff completed a deeper review. The results arrived in a formal memorandum. I read it twice, then a third time. The planning reference cited repeatedly during development reviews could not be verified through original source records. Supporting documentation had never been located. More importantly, no evidence established that permanent corridor rights had ever been formally granted through the historical process being referenced. The room fell silent when we finished reading. Mini hook. The assumption at the center of everything suddenly looked very fragile. The follow-up hearing took place under clear skies. Sunlight filled the courthouse windows. The atmosphere felt noticeably different from previous sessions. The judge reviewed the new findings carefully. Historical numbering discrepancies. Missing source records. Original survey language. Temporary accommodation references. Planning concerns documented over multiple decades. Piece by piece, the timeline finally came together. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The documents carried enough weight on their own. Victoria appeared far less confident than before. Her legal team spent much of the hearing addressing gaps rather than presenting new support. That contrast mattered. The discussion was no longer about what people believed. It was about what records actually showed. Hours later, the hearing concluded. This time, the judge announced that a written ruling would be issued soon. Not immediately. Soon. The waiting period felt longer than the previous months combined. traffic still crossed my ranch. Expansion plans remained technically active. Publicly, nothing had changed yet. Privately, everything had. 3 mornings later, my attorney called before sunrise. I stepped onto the porch as dawn spread across the hills. The smell of wet grass drifted through the cool air. His voice sounded calm, deliberate, the kind of calm that usually arrives after a long journey. Then he told me the ruling had been released. The first paragraph changed the entire future of Willow Creek Estates. The first paragraph was only a few lines long, yet it carried more weight than every meeting, lawsuit, survey stake, and planning presentation combined. I stood on my porch reading it while dawn light spread across the hills. Birds moved through the oak trees. The smell of wet grass lingered in the cool morning air. My attorney remained on the phone while I read each sentence carefully. The ruling concluded that the evidence did not establish permanent access rights through the corridor crossing my ranch. Temporary accommodation language, original survey records, and historical planning references all pointed in the same direction. Assumptions were not ownership. Expectations were not rights. Future development plans could not create authority that the underlying records never granted. I lowered the papers and looked toward the road. For the first time since this began, the future felt different. Minnie Hook. The legal fight ended with a sentence. The consequences lasted much longer. News traveled quickly. By noon, local reporters were calling attorneys, consultants, and county officials. Homeowners began asking questions. Developers started reassessing timelines. The same expansion plans that once looked inevitable suddenly faced a very different reality. Traffic continued moving through the road temporarily while transition discussions took place. Yet everyone now understood the situation had changed. The foundation supporting the entire project no longer existed in the form people believed. Over the following weeks, negotiations replaced courtroom arguments. County officials became involved. Engineers reviewed alternatives. Developers explored new access options. Survey crews appeared across neighboring properties. Fresh markers showed up in locations completely unrelated to my ranch. The shift was impossible to miss. Energy that once focused on taking control of an existing corridor now focused on building something new. Clay visited one evening as the sun disappeared behind the hills. We stood beside the same gate where bulldozers had arrived. Months earlier, the HOA sign was gone. So were the landscaping features installed around it. Wind moved through the cedar trees. The road looked quieter somehow. Funny how records outlast opinions, Clay said. I nodded. There was not much else to add. The documents had spoken for themselves. Victoria Ashcroft remained involved for a time. Publicly, she framed the outcome as a necessary clarification process. Privately, her influence seemed to fade. Community meetings grew more cautious. Residents asked harder questions. Consultants spent more time explaining assumptions. People wanted supporting documents. They wanted proof. Trust, once lost, rarely returns unchanged. Several months later, construction finally began on an alternative access route. The new corridor required significant investment. Additional engineering reviews, utility relocation planning, drainage work, permitting. Everything that should have been considered before expansion assumptions became expansion promises. One afternoon, I drove to a ridge overlooking part of the project. Heavy equipment moved slowly across distant terrain. The smell of fresh earth carried on the wind. Survey flags stretched across the landscape. Looking at the activity, I felt no satisfaction from anyone's setback. What I felt was relief. The solution now rested on reality instead of assumptions. That mattered. Back at the ranch, life gradually returned to normal. Mornings began with coffee and fence inspections again. Evenings ended with quiet drives across the property. The constant stream of legal paperwork disappeared. The workshop slowly transformed back into a workshop instead of a command center. Maps came down. Binders were archived. The timeline wall finally disappeared. Yet one item remained. The original survey attachment sat framed above my desk. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. A faded document stored in a forgotten archive had changed the outcome of a multi-million-dollar development plan. Not because it was dramatic, because it was accurate. Months later, I stopped beside the road one final time as sunset painted the hills gold. Traffic moved steadily in the distance. The air smelled of cedar and dry grass. Everything looked peaceful. The same road that sparked so much conflict now felt ordinary again. Maybe that was the real ending. Not victory, not defeat, just the truth returning to where it belonged. Some roads carry cars. This one carried a lesson.